Hi. Following the Civil War, the United States tried to rebuild and it wanted to put the war behind it. And so it wanted to move forward. And we're going to look at how those efforts succeeded both in the North and in what they called the New South. Let's look first at how the New South changed. And this idea of the New South began to develop. For the South, following the Civil War, where they were in a transitional period, how are they going to go from the old ways, the old South, the plantations and slavery, toward a new industrial South? And what you see is the rise of a class of rulers, sometimes called the Redeemers or the Bourbons. And this was based upon the old French aristocracy, the Bourbon class, and they just took the name. And so the Bourbon class, this was the elite of the New South, very similar to the old Southern aristocracy, and in fact, oftentimes their children or their descendants, so very much related. Some of these proponents of the New South ideology included newspapermen, Henry Grady, for example, Walter Hines Page, Sidney Lanier. All of these were newspaper editors or writers who talked about moving the South forward into the New Age following the Civil War, putting aside slavery and the plantation and looking forward to new industry. Economically, politically, and socially, there was industrialization, to be sure. There was the development of machinery and technology and industry related to those things the South already was good at. So the South already had cotton, so it made sense to develop textile industries. The South had tobacco, and so the cigar and cigarette industry flourished. They also had metal, there were steel works, and they started building more railroads. And so you start to see the development of larger cities in the South, a better economy, and more emphasis on education, because for all that industry and technology, they realized that they were going to need a better educated workforce. Some of the changes, however, were not welcome, and these included taxation. They continued to want a weak government. They didn't want a big government. They wanted lower taxes, and they felt that if they allowed too much government supervision, too much government action, it would raise taxes. They also wanted to make sure, following the Civil War, that the Republicans who were in control were no longer in control. They sought to limit Republican voters, who were especially African American, and they also wanted to get rid of what they call carpetbaggers and scalawags, those Northerners who had come down, who they believed in mass, to run the South following the Civil War, or turncoats, betrayers, and these are the scalawags. They were Southerners who embraced the Republican Party. And as a result, one of the things that you see that goes away, there had been for a time, for example, Texas, where the Republican administrations had tried to start school systems. And so this was done away with following what they called redemption, the elimination of these Republican administrations, letting the Democrats come back into power, redeem the South, they said. Businesses also benefited because of the low tax structure, and so you do see the development of factories, railroads, utility companies that come in and are able to benefit from low wages and low taxes. In the South, they still wanted to maintain some sense of the old ways, this ideas of the chivalric South and the grace and the pomp and the grandeur of the Old South. And so you do see the development of this Old South culture, especially in the cult of the lost cause. This cult of the lost cause was a romantic vision of the Old South in the days of before the Civil War. So the lost cause was the Civil War and this idea of Southern nationalism and the idea of this once great South that after the Civil War was destroyed. You also see some evidence that they were trying to preserve some aspects of slavery, or at least the romantic notion of slavery. The old book by Joel Chandler Harris, so old to us today, was Uncle Remus, these tales of Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, Brer Hound, supposedly told by a slave to young children who he was taking care of. Uncle Remus preserved the dialect and some of the stories of the romantic imageries of the days of slavery. But they also told the story of underdogs, right, of how people who were oppressed and threatened would somehow achieve success. You also see the increase in more women moving into the workforce in the South. Previously, that had been looked down upon, but now is becoming an economic reality following the Civil War. For African Americans in the South, the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction did mean new political power. For the first time, most African Americans in the United States did live in the South. However, in 1879, because of opportunities out west, which we'll talk about in future lectures, a group of about 20,000 migrated to Kansas to take advantage of free land opportunities in the West. These were known as Exodusters, led by a man by the name of Pap Singleton. And they wanted to take advantage of the West. It wasn't a very popular move in the South, and some states prevented these Exodusters, some of these African Americans, these former slaves, from leaving because they feared they were going to lose their workforce. African Americans were allowed, however, to vote in the South, and this may surprise some people, but they actually continued to vote up until about the 1890s, when stronger efforts were made to limit their political participation. And of course, in the South, you do see segregation and the rise of what we call Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow was a character out of a minstrel show. This was when performers would put on blackface and pretend and adopt racial stereotypes and pretend to be African Americans singing and dancing. So this was the name given to segregation and discrimination at the time. It was put into law by the Supreme Court in a case that came out of Louisiana known as Plessy versus Ferguson. In this case, 1896, Homer Plessy was by all looks and thought, a white person, but he was in reality, according to the law of the time, African American because he had a descendant who was African American, and the social mores of the time in the South said that if you had one drop of African American blood, you were considered black. And so he was riding first class in a train. The conductor was alerted by one of Plessy's companions. This was a test case. They wanted to challenge the law. Was alerted that Plessy was indeed African American, and so he was ordered to go to the black section, the black car, out of first class. This case went to the Supreme Court, which decided that since it was an in-state law and it wasn't affected by the national interstate travel laws, which prohibited segregation, that because this was in the state of Louisiana, Louisiana could segregate. And the basis on which this was hinged was a term that the phrase that we've come to hear many years since. This was separate but equal. As long as accommodations were separate but equal, it wasn't segregation. Of course, in practice, they were never equal, but they were always separate. Another horrible mark on the South was the number of lynchings that increased during the post-Reconstruction period. By about the 1890s is when they hit their peak, and they're at about 187 per year. So this was the extra-legal murder and quote-unquote trial of mostly black men in the South that were accused of things, most of them being some sort of sexual attack on white women. Rape, for example, or looking at somebody the wrong way or making a suggestive comment could get someone lynched. And these are usually horrible, long, torturous affairs ending in the murder through hanging, hanging or burning of the individual accused of the crime, whether or not in reality he was guilty. But it was a way of keeping African Americans in line and in check for Southern whites. Then there was also the disenfranchisement. By this we mean the reduction of the voting power. And it was done a number of ways. Up until the 1890s, as I said previously, African Americans were voting in the South. But after the 1890s, after Plessy versus Ferguson, the Southern states took on other ways of excluding blacks from the ballot box. One of those was the infamous Mississippi Plan that came about right at the turn of the century. And in this, upheld by a court case, Williams versus Mississippi, this allowed literacy tests. So somebody could come in and they would have to read and interpret part of the Constitution or some other document. Now, the catch was that it was up to the election judge to determine whether or not they passed that test or not. And so certainly discrimination could be used. And you had cases where African Americans with PhDs were brought in to take these tests, and they failed. Now, obviously, they could read and they could interpret the Constitution, but it was up to the prejudicial viewpoint of the judge to make the final allowance of whether or not to say someone passed or they didn't. So there was plenty of room for corruption there as well. It's also known as the time of the Atlanta Compromise. This was based upon a speech given by Booker T. Washington of the Tuskegee Institute, which was a teacher training institute in Alabama for African Americans. And in this famous speech, the Atlanta Compromise, Booker T. Washington told African Americans not to seek high office or to seek elevated positions, but to, as he put it, cast down your bucket where you are. Stay in the South, continue to live in Southern conditions, and contribute to the South no matter what your social or economic status is. Many people saw this as a sellout and resented Booker T. Washington, but if you look at the conditions in which he was operating and the audience to whom he was speaking, which was predominantly white philanthropists, he was hoping to raise money for his school, he was really giving them the message they wanted to hear. And so some people have criticized him for it, it's most especially W.E.B. Du Bois, who was from the North and an African-American activist who really called Booker T. Washington to task. But many have looked back upon Washington and said that he was doing this because of where he was and to whom he was speaking. In the North, following the Civil War, there were great changes. Of course, the North was victorious, and they already had industry and growth in the industrial area, but it just continued to expand. They had much more access to raw materials. They had many more people coming in, increasing their labor supply through immigration. You had a lot of inventions that were being not only patented, but also being encouraged by companies who were encouraging inventiveness. And so in a variety of companies, you see new inventions coming in left and right. There were so many patents issued during this time that it outnumbered many of the patent numbers that had gone on before. And the federal government did what they could to promote this. There was land grants, allowing businesses to use public resources. There were tariffs that protected American industry and American business. There were efforts at changing banking and monetary system to promote business. And of course, land giveaways, especially to railroads. So all of these help promote industrial growth. As far as inventions, I'm going to go back to this and talk about how the technology affected many Americans. Some of the inventions that you see in the late 1800s, early 1900s include the invention of the telephone. Electricity is a common staple of the home. Large industrial centers began to develop, and these were mainly in cities. You have these industrial cities. The beginnings of the automobile in the late 1800s. We think about the automobiles in the 1920s, but actually the industry had started before that. And you also have corporations that have within their organization research and development offices whose job it was to promote industry and development and technology within the business and to find new ways of adapting new existing technology or inventing new ones. So it was a time of much inventiveness. You also see on the downside, because of the immigrants coming in, a huge increase in population. And with that comes the rise of larger and larger cities. But so between the time of the Civil War and 1910, you see an increase in rural people doubling, but increasing 7 times in the urban areas. And largely this is due to migrations of people moving in. Many of these people are coming in from rural areas, and so the cities are new to them. Sometimes they're going to New York or Chicago, Boston, but other times they're also coming in, especially Scandinavian immigrants are coming into Midwestern areas, and German immigrants into places like Chicago, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, and Cincinnati. And so you see people in the Midwest and in the Northeast coming into these areas, and population just really explodes. And these new immigrants don't necessarily represent the Northern Europeans of previous immigration circles. Many of these immigrants, some of these are Eastern European, especially Russian Jewish immigrants who are fleeing pogroms or organized attacks by state police in Russia that were driving them further and further toward the west to Western Europe, and then from Western Europe they were coming to the United States. And many of these immigrants, also Greek immigrants and immigrants from Turkey and Italy and the Mediterranean region, these are going to be Jewish, Catholic, sometimes Orthodox Catholic, but not the traditional Protestant and Anglo-Saxon immigrants that you'd seen in previous migrations. And this causes some concern. You see the growth of skyscrapers. Now, this is largely because of the steel industry, and this is going to replace wooden buildings in cities. So now buildings can become taller, people can move into these buildings, and so this is going to change the dynamics in some of these large urban areas. You're also going to see an increase in city services, and by that, the professionalization of fire and police departments are especially noteworthy, because before that, some of these services were done by private organizations, private individuals, and it just wasn't cutting mustard anymore. You needed to have city-run, government-run services like the police and the fire department to deal with the mass immigration and the changes in the cities. In the South, you do see an increase in farm tenancy and in sharecropping. Now, we tend to look down upon sharecropping, and we tend to think that it represented poverty. Actually, what sharecroppers were up-and-coming owners, landowners. What they were doing was buying the land on shares. So they would split the profits of crops that they planted and split that with the landowner in order to buy and pay off their debt. However, if they could not do that, they often fell into farm tenancy. And tenants were simply workers who lived on the land. They didn't have any claim to the land. They weren't going to own the land. And what happens is, because of economic conditions and because of migration and because we were on the gold standard, it made it harder and harder for people to have money. You see an increase in farm tenancy. Sharecroppers who were trying to buy their land couldn't afford it and became tenants. And so you see this rise in tenancy, and that among African Americans, because they were poor more often than not and hadn't previously been landowners, certainly was marked. But also you see white and immigrant sharecroppers and tenants as well. Of course, in the South, it was a time of segregation, which I talked about earlier. And although there were changes in agriculture and there's promises of the New South of moving beyond the cotton crops and into different types of crops and different types of ways of raising money, it was all very limited because cotton controlled so much of the economy. People who were lending money, bankers and even stores who were lending money to sharecroppers and to other people farming land, were not going to lend money on unsure crops. Cotton, they knew, could bring in money, even though it was unstable. And so they tried to limit people to cotton, even though other crops were needed and were necessary. And also efforts at disfranchising African Americans, keeping them away from the polls, also harmed the process of democracy in the South because you were limiting the electoral pool. In the North, there were certainly problems as well. There were a lot of people coming in seeking wealth and hoping to get rich in America, and not everyone was prosperous, of course. The life of the immigrant has been documented. People like Jacob Riis, who was a social worker, went around photographing some of the Jewish immigrants coming into New York, and Italian immigrants and others. And his book, How the Other Half Lives, illustrated through photographs the problem of the slums. Because many of the older buildings in the northern cities, as they were becoming more and more crowded, were wooden, these cities were susceptible to fire. And so you have the Great Fire in Chicago, you have fires in San Francisco, and fires in other large northern cities. Now they're replacing these buildings with steel buildings and with skyscrapers, which are less likely to burn. But for the time being, the fires, and combine that with largely a volunteer fire force, these fires could be quite devastating in life and other property loss. Certainly there was a lot of overcrowding. There was also, as poverty increased, a perception among some people that some poor were deserving. These were poor people that should be helped because they were trying to work themselves out of poverty. However, there were undeserving poor. There were people who were seen as burdens on society, and there was no cause to help them in many people's minds. So this idea of the deserving poor, those poor people who could work their way out, became more prominent. We'll talk more about this in a later lecture. And of course, crime and violence go in. There was also the problem of labor. As these people were coming in, many times they were working for very, very low wages, and they began to organize unions and other types of groups to try to fight for their rights, fight for better wages. And this had many problems, which we'll see later on, and it wasn't welcome because many business owners didn't want to pay higher wages. So there were improvements to both regions. You saw the expansion of railroads, better technology. Even though we talk about poverty, the incomes did rise. Many people who came in with nothing were seeing better wages, even if it was very small wages. And you also see better education. As a result of the wages and the education, you also have the development of leisure time and consumer products, that people are actually going out and buying things at department stores, which were a new thing. And people were buying things from stores like Sears and Montgomery Ward's, which were offering mail catalog, sort of the Amazon of their day, where people could be in rural areas, order something, have it delivered. Of course, it wasn't coming in as quick as it is in Amazon, but it would be delivered. Houses in the Midwest and rural areas were Sears houses. They had been brought in on the train, assembled by local people. They were bought through these department stores and these catalog stores. And you also see women's roles change. So there's a great deal of improvement in both regions, but there's also problems, right? These changes in both the North and the South, we tend to give the name the Gilded Age. This was a term Mark Twain, the writer, coined. Gilded means gold-coated. Golden on the outside, but you weren't too sure of what was on the inside. It might be a baser metal, a more common metal. And so it was flashy and showy on the outside, and that's what Twain was trying to get across. There was a time of change and a time of confusion, both politically, socially, economically, and it affected everyone. There was a great amount of wealth. More people were getting wealthy, but more people were also getting on the other side of the rich-poor divide. Working conditions were harsh and long. There was a lot of graft and corruption, usually aimed at politicians. There was also the rise of leisure time and sports activities, dancing and other types of entertainment that more people could afford to take part in, even working class people. And of course, consumerism. So these are some of the changes we saw in both the North and the South following the Civil War.